Get ready for the best holiday sale of the year. For a limited time, enjoy 50% off annual news subscriptions at inforum.news/gift. That's right, 50% off unlimited access to local news so you can stay informed and connected to your community. It's a gift you'll want to give yourself. This incredible holiday offer ends December 22nd, so don't miss out. Subscribe now at inforum.news/gift.
Welcome to Plain Talk. There's been some headlines recently about pass-through grants. And, it's whether you want to talk about a fertilizer plant or the, dollars that were used or sent to a program that was used by former Senator Ray Holmberg to travel to Europe, trips during which, there's still a lot of haze around that. And certainly he's been charged with crimes, but has not been convicted of them yet, but is accused of inappropriate activity with children in Europe or traveling there to seek that. Grants were a part of that. Grants kind of everywhere. And it made me think a little bit of, recently the state Supreme Court pulled the legislature's card on something that they've been doing for a long time, which is passing bills with multiple topics in the bill. That's prescribed by the state constitution, but the legislature was kind of doing it anyway. And the state Supreme Court called them on it, which is why it necessitated a recent special session. They had to come and unwind an omnibus spending and policy bill and pass it again as separate bills. Another issue I think are these pass-through grants. There's lots of them. A recent headline that I've been writing about are filmmakers, where it was $700,000 in grants. And although, where those grants were supposed to go was not written in the bills themselves, if you drill a little deeper and you listen to committee testimony, you look at some of the footnotes and some of the other notes and the amendments that were made to those bills, it was clear the legislature had picked a winner, picked a destination for those dollars. And again, we have language in the state constitution, which says it's called the gift clause. It says the legislature is not just supposed to give money to a single company or individual. So anyway, here to talk with us about all that is State Senator Tim Mathern. He's a Democrat from Fargo. Of course, Ben Hansen joining me as my co-host on Wednesdays. Senator Mathern, how are you?
I am great. I'm glad to join you.
Tell us a little bit about this issue, because I know that you're beginning to look into this issue. What, if any, of this concerns you?
Well, as I was hearing about some of these grants, for example, the film grant, I decided just to dig a little deeper, and I asked Legislative Counsel to give me a list of these grants that we have done just this legislative session. So I find the list was $23 million worth. And that didn't even include $10 million that went to Grand Farm. It didn't include the $125 million that went to a fertilizer plant. And so it just came to me as expressing how we have changed as a legislature. And I think the change really relates to the fact that we don't really have a strong two-party system. So when you don't have a strong two-party system, it seems to me there's just less scrutiny in the process about what we're doing. And then we get lax and start to do things that are kind of edgy and on the margins. So I think this is part of a bigger issue than just these grants at this time.
And Senator Mathern, I think that I would actually kind of think on paper, most folks would agree with the idea that less scrutiny kind of comes as one party control, be it either party, and depending on what state you're in, is kind of controlling all the levers of state government. But I'd like to get in even a little bit further with what you said about there's $10 million you mentioned going to Grand Farm and $125 million going to a fertilizer plant that weren't counted as grants. Can you kind of help our listeners? Because I don't quite understand, why isn't that marked as a grant? Is that just marked as a subsidy? Because they're all coming from taxpayer dollars from the general fund, right? They're all coming from the same place.
Yeah. And I, as I did the research regarding the $10 million, here I found that it was actually a designation in the 21-23 legislative session, and it went through the proper process, but the money didn't flow until the 23-25 session. And so that's why it didn't show up on this list. The allocation was made in the session before. And then in the case of the $125 million to the fertilizer plant, there were constraints on that. It wasn't a direct grant to a specific company. It was, in fact, a grant to the Sustainable Renewable Energy Fund controlled by the Industrial Commission. So there were and are processes in place to attempt to assure there's some sort of competition and some sort of vetting. But where these other grants in the $23 million list were like a direct, here's the cash to do this thing.
But even when there's ostensibly a competitive process, and I'm going back again to the film grants, there was a group of, I think it was like 17 filmmakers, and Matt Fern, one of those filmmakers, was a guest previously on the podcast. If you folks didn't listen to that interview, go back and listen to that one. There's about 17 filmmakers representing what I would say is probably the bulk of North Dakota's film industry, which is not that big. And they're up there and they're saying, well, there was a finger on the scale because there was ostensibly a competitive process, but it only lasted for 10 calendar days, 6 business days. And if you go back and again read the amendment that was put on that added that $600,000 appropriation to the Commerce Department's budget in the legislative session earlier this year, it says specifically in there, it names the company Canonical Productions. So it seems to me, Tim, that even when there exists a competitive process that these grants are supposed to go through, which I agree, when that competitive process exists, I think that gets you around the gift clause, because then you're like funding a program, not necessarily funding a specific individual. But when the amendment says $600,000 to go to Canonical Productions, I mean, it's name checked in there. Now I don't think you're getting around the gift clause. And it kind of seems like we did the competitive process just as, I don't know what you want to call, just lipstick or something on it. Like it wasn't really a competitive process, which, by the way, if I had spent the time to put in an application to that process, knowing that the legislature had already named who they wanted to get the money, I would be upset that I wasted my time and energy on something like that. But speak to that a little bit, because I mean, you're right. There is ostensibly a competitive process, but a lot of times I think everybody knows where the money's going.
Well, you're correct, but I just want to clarify on the fertilizer plant, there was a much more extensive process than there is on the film grant.
Fair enough.
On the film grant, literally, it wasn't even the legislature who decided. There were 6 people in a conference committee who made that decision, right, and then added the wording in terms of their conference committee activity that this one group was to get that money. Well, that information didn't even get to the full legislature. I mean, so when I voted on that subcommittee conference committee activity was not in the bill. So we have some processes even internally where not all the legislators know that this money was actually earmarked to a certain company. So, You're correct, Rob. There are problems in the process. I think this has sort of evolved through the years in a way that demonstrates now it's above and beyond what we should be doing. And I'm introducing a bill to correct that, to make sure that it's clear where the money is going when the money went out, that during half time, in a sense, during the middle of the granting money use, that there's a report in terms of how half was spent thus far and what are the plans for the next half. And then report at the end, how was the money spent? What are the outcomes and what are the plans for the next biennium? So, Rob, you're correct. The process needs change, and that's the way I think we should change it.
You took my question from me, Tim. I was going to ask you how aware you felt your fellow legislators were of this granting process, because to me, what you're describing, and then you kind of answered it, it seems that it's not the entire legislature that's aware of where these monies are going, which to me seems that's a big red flag to me when you're spending taxpayer dollars, and not a red flag because it's nefarious. It's a real problem with the process. There should not be public dollars that legislators aren't being made aware of. Have you spoken to other legislators about this bill that you're proposing? Are you going to be screening it through any interim committees? Have you gotten any response, or is this just starting?
This is really just starting, but I feel partially responsible for this because in the end, I actually vote on these bills now, and
you do.
But I'm finding myself as needing more help to figure out what the details are. And so that's why I think we need this reporting process. So a legislator who's not on that 6-member committee also knows what that 6-member committee did. And I want to add one more piece. I don't want to sound partisan, but this is the first session in all of the sessions I have been in, and I go back almost 40 years. This is the first session where that conference committee at the end that puts together all of these grants has not had a Democrat on the committee. The first time ever. And I've been there when Republicans were in charge. I've been in there when Democrats have been in charge. And there's always been somebody from the other party on that final 6-member committee that puts together this Christmas tree bill. And it was not happening this time. And so it's part of our macro process that is needing to be changed here also. It's not really just the detail about reporting on the grants. It's also on our macro process. So we have eyes and ears. We should have a journalist required to be there. I mean, literally, the eyes and ears of the people. Generally, the eyes and ears of the people are the parties.
Well,
because the parties then get the word out. But we actually need, beyond that, we need journalists at that table.
Well, I don't know how that would work, man. I mean, we like to be in the room. I don't know that you could mandate that. But to your point, I mean, it is really hard. I mean, my job is to catch these things in the bills too. I don't always see them, or if I do see them, maybe I don't recognize their import at the time until later. But certainly I think it's an issue now. And your point about we should this is the problem with single party rule. And I agree with that. That is one of the downsides. The other problem is this is what the voters have chosen.
Right.
The voters have chosen to have just 4 Democrats in the state Senate. And I don't know. That's probably a topic for another podcast. But to me, I'm really interested in this process. And I was looking at your bill, and one thing I really think, and it seems duplicative, frankly, to put it in statute when it's already in the state constitution. But I feel like the legislature is playing with fire with some of this stuff, where eventually if the right person, the right plaintiff, puts a case before the state Supreme Court and says, this violates this grant violates the gift clause. If one of these filmmakers were to file suit and said this grant violates the gift clause because they had in the legislation that it was supposed to go to this company, the court might strike this sort of thing down. Now think if it's something like the fertilizer plant, where you have what is admittedly an important project economically for our state, and a huge amount of taxpayer dollars, 120 some odd $1 million. And now all of a sudden it all gets waylaid by the courts because the legislature did a sloppy job. Now, I'm not saying that the fertilizer plant money, I'm just saying if they keep, it just seems sloppy. And it seems like if they did it more transparently and more rigorously, we wouldn't have that risk. I feel like they're creating a risk for themselves again, where they're going to get called up by the courts again.
Well, it's correct. And if we are doing this as a legislature, we're going down the slippery slope. We've already been called on the constitutionality of this funding pattern. We've already been called up on the constitutionality of our redistricting. It would not surprise me, Rob, if we were called out on the constitutionality of the filming grant, for example. And I think there's a host of issues, and we have gone down a slope here, and we need to stop. We need to stop that slope process that we're in. And you're correct when you say, okay, the citizens decided who to put in the legislature. But I think this podcast and the news that you're working on and other things is helping this citizen say, oh, I need to be a little more attentive about who I vote for. This is not just a simple deal, R and D. Maybe I, as a citizen, need to figure out, okay, which legislature or which candidate in my district is attentive to these details.
Yeah,
which one is not?
Because I don't want this to become a partisan issue. I think it's just we need to elect just a better class of leader, whatever party they're coming from, because there's a lot of very frustrating things happening. Although the redistricting thing, that wasn't a constitutional issue so much as it violated the Voting Rights Act, which is a mess when you look at the law and the jurisprudence around it. But that's a topic for another podcast.
Without getting into that, Tim, or not too far down that side, Tim, I want to ask you, the changes in culture, you mentioned, you go back a ways here, the changes in culture, the changes in formatting with the legislature when it comes to grants specifically. You've watched and been part of this process for almost 4 decades, like you said. David Hogue, the majority leader, for instance, in the Senate, has been around for some time and has seen these changes. I know Michael Forer's a little bit newer, but I mean, he's been around for several sessions. You have, I think, Don Vigasaw still in assistant leadership. I'm calling other names to say they have been institutions. You've all been around for decades combined. What do you think created the change in maybe scrutiny? I don't want to sound too nefarious or too blaming in my language, but what changed about the way this grant process was done? Or did we even have these type of grants before? And maybe I just don't know. Maybe we're in an embarrassment of riches now as a state economically, and we need to handle and create some new transparency for. What do you think changed?
Well, I think a number of things changed, but one of them is we still are in an 80-day session legislature every other year, which is totally contrary to the pace of change in our society. So from the beginning of the legislative session to the end, changes are happening in society that don't permit a hearing and a vetting process of an issue. I took, for example, I looked at the guardianship piece in there. Well, here I notice from the beginning to the end of the legislature, we're finding out that there are so many people in hospitals taking up care and costing a lot of money, basically because there's nobody deciding. There's no guardian saying, yes, there should be a no resuscitation order here, or this person should be discharged, or this person should be changed. So we put some money in grants. Now, with those grants, there's reporting every 4 months and all that, but that's a good example of a change happening. If our session was going to meet every year, we would have done a piece of that and said, hey, let's look into this in further detail. Or if there were more days, we would have spent more time on that. Changes in society are going faster than the system we have in place. That's one thing. The second thing is we have less support for state employees than we did in times past. So government, or maybe our citizens or our present leadership, don't want to add staff persons. They want to get a certain project done, but they don't want to add staff persons. So they've developed this grant process to get stuff done without adding FTEs. A lot of these things, we could just add some FTEs so we have control over their daily work. We have control of the policies and procedures, but we don't want to add FTEs. So that's the second thing.
And I'm guessing if FTEs are brought up in committee, that's usually met with the response that is growing government. But would you say here that
we've added a lot of FTEs
more with grants?
Are you sure? Because we've I mean, maybe we're not adding them, but it seems like we've added a lot of FTEs over the last 10 years. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I didn't expect to be talking about this, but I mean, the number of FTEs in state government's grown pretty significantly.
Well, I'm just saying what people want of state government is even more than the FTEs they're willing to allocate.
Well, that gets back that gets back to the voters, though, where you have, I mean, I think the voters sometimes are sometimes schizophrenic on where, I mean, look at nationally. I always say, we want low taxes and we want big government, and the federal government delivers it and finances it with budget deficits. So I agreed. A lot of times we want a lot more out of the government than we're willing to pay for, which is another topic for a whole other podcast.
Well, take, for example, a fertilizer plant. That's a $3 billion operation. As a state, we could literally do that. I mean, we did it with the Bank of North Dakota. We did it with the State Mill and Elevator. We did it with the North Dakota Insurance Reserve Fund. We could literally take over that industry and make sure every farmer in North Dakota's got fertilizer and do it cheaper. But our present appetite for state employees doesn't support putting that together. So we put out $100 million grant for some private company to do this.
I will tell you, I would rather do a grant than to have a state-owned fertilizer plant.
Grant. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. That is one of the rationales for the grants then. Because people like
changes were in the grant system, so that's to the point.
I mean, to me, I don't have a problem with the grants so much as I have a problem with we're getting a little too cozy with the people getting the grants. We're putting our finger on the scale. Things that are supposed to be competitive grants are not really all that competitive. That to me is more problematic than the idea of the grants themselves. I think, I mean, when we were talking about, why did this come to be? Senator Mathern's at a conference, so you're probably hearing an announcement in the background right now. One of the, for why this came to be, I mean, to my mind, it was two things. I think there are a lot of Republicans who have just gotten very, very comfortable with power. They don't fear Democrats. They don't feel like Democrats can beat them at the ballot box, and so I think sometimes they take shortcuts, and they worry a little bit less about the rigor, about the process, about the appearance, because they don't think they're ever going to lose an election. That and the fact that our state has had a lot of money to spend in recent years, thanks to oil activity or whatever you want to, oil activity primarily. We've had a lot of money to spend. And let's face it, when you're a politician, it's a lot easier, it's a lot less risky to say yes than no, right? I mean, why say no when you could say yes, and we've got this huge bounty of money that allows us to say yes a lot? To me, I think those are the two things driving it. That's what it looks like to me.
Well, before you cut me off, that was my third item.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Which is fine.
I should just shut up and listen. I'm sorry.
It was, we literally have more money.
Yeah.
And we are blessed with more resources. You know, there's some legislators who think that or say that it's harder in these legislative sessions when you have money. I think that's baloney. It's a lot easier to legislate and to be in the legislature when there's money. In fact, back in the years when Sinner was governor, we literally ended a legislative session with $60,000. I mean, now we end the legislative session with $100 million in this fund, $100 million in that fund, $100 million in that fund. So times have changed for North Dakota, and it gives us resources to do some things. And sometimes we have taken some risks in these grants that are positive, but sometimes we've done it in such a way that's not really fair.
And Senator Mathern, I think the things you're highlighting are well worth folks knowing. We've done a lot of what winds up happening inevitably with conversations about public policy. We're throwing around a lot of big numbers: 125 million, 600,000, 10 million for Grand Farm. Where can a person who's not a legislator or not a lobbyist go? A concerned citizen, somebody who's listening to this podcast, who's otherwise a news consumer but doesn't know, hey, where do I look up these numbers? Where can the average North Dakota taxpayer go to educate themselves on where these dollars are, where they're going? Is there an easy way to educate yourself, or if not an easy way, a starter place that they could go that you would recommend?
You know, that's one thing that's changed in government that's really positive. We do have access through these electronic means, Office of Management Budget, NDOMB. We have data there about all of these numbers. We have bills that have been passed by the legislature under NDLEGIS, ndlegis.gov. So we have places where all of this information is available. However, it is a challenge for citizens. They're raising their kids and they're going to work and trying to make sure their car starts in the winter. There's stuff going on. And so we need intermediaries. I mean, this is where I think part of the problem is. We don't have enough journalists. When I was in the legislature early on, every major newspaper in the state had a staff person. And they were digging around, going to this meeting or that meeting. Well, now we just have a handful. And so
I someone's got to pay those guys the salaries too for those journalists. Look, Rob, I did your part for you.
I am very happy with how I'm compensated. I'm very happy with form. Listen, I think our company does a great job. But we're one company. The demise of our industry, and a lot of it has to do with people don't want to pay for news anymore. Although, again, I should say we've been doing great with our subscriptions. Thank you for everybody. Yeah. To everybody who subscribes, your support goes a long way, but when people say they want journalists there to cover it, well, you got to pay for your news then. You got to subscribe to these papers. Otherwise, where do we get the money? Advertising, especially in the age where, Google and Facebook and everything have gutted the online. We can't make enough from ads, to do what we do. We need people to subscribe and to support journalism. And I agree with you. And, I look around sometimes at like the sort of cover. I don't know that there's anybody else in North Dakota. I mean, not to toot my horn, but I find myself covering a lot of these issues by myself. There's not a lot of us, certainly not a lot of other in-depth coverage on this stuff. And, I don't know what causes that. Maybe we just don't have enough people.
Well, I think in some ways, I think like Rob, I think you have kind of a investigation background, so you have a skill level that's a little different. And, that's important. And we literally need people. In a legislative session, there might be 20 committee meetings going on at the exact same time. And how do we get somebody to be at that committee meeting where there were 6 people who sat down and made this deal about the grants for the films?
Well, one thing I know our company has done in conjunction with the Bismarck Tribune is we share each other's stories now so that we don't have to send both of our reporters to the same, because there might be one committee hearing that's I don't want to say it's the most important, but it's the most interesting or the most it's attracting the most attention. In this way, because we're sharing each other's stories, we could our reporter in the Capitol can work with the Tribune reporter and vice versa and say, you cover this one, I'll cover that one, and they can cover more. But again, you're still just talking about 2 reporters, and it's tough. Anyway, we're up against the time. Senator Mathern, thank you so much. This is not an issue that's going to go away. I'm hoping, and again, I don't want people to think that we're getting down on these grants. A lot of these grants they have the right motivations behind them. They're going to worthy endeavors. The problem is not necessarily the grants. The problem is the process. I think you agree with that, Senator.
Yes, certainly. And frankly, we're all responsible for this. I take responsibility for part of this. And that's why I want to tweak and change the system. And I'm hoping the citizens are of the same voice, that they want some changes, and we'll support some of these changes, and we'll all do a better job next time.
Senator Mathern, thank you for your time.
Take care.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, just finish up with Senator Tim Mathern. And, again, the constitutional question there is the one that's really interesting to me. I think that this is a part of the state constitution that is getting ignored. And I think we've gotten to a point where we just see it gets in the way, and so we're just going to pretend like it doesn't exist, and we're going to cut checks directly to companies, or we're going to have this thin veneer of there being a competitive process when really everyone knows where it's going. I think that's right. The Constitution says what it says, and if you don't want it to say that, then amend it. And if we're not going to amend it, then we're obliged to follow it. And I would like to see it followed.
Wouldn't want that part of the Constitution. That I'm guessing that would have in a poll or a vote 80-90% support. Well, right?
I don't know. But one thing that everybody gets, that they always want, when we talk about like the legacy fund and stuff, people will say, well, we should have something like what Alaska has, where they have a permanent fund and they cut everybody checks. Well, what do you think's getting in the way of that? We have a gift clause in the state constitution, and we can't just cut direct checks directly to people like that. Not to mention, I, as a former Alaska citizen who has literally received permanent fund payments, I can also tell you that those revenues don't come from a tax. Those revenues come from the state's royalties from oil and gas development on state-owned land. So philosophically, I have a problem. If we're going to do with a legacy fund, I have a problem taxing one group of people and then just giving the revenues to another group of people.
The royalties are coming from private sector oil companies, right?
Right. But it's not a tax.
But how is it not taxed by another name?
Well, no, it's not a tax, because they can, if I'm being taxed, I can't choose not to pay the tax. Whereas if I'm paying a royalty, it's the same royalty I would pay if I developed on somebody's privately owned land. It's just the cost of doing business. In this case, the person you're doing business with is the state. it's a philosophical point. I understand. Anyway, suffice it to say,
keep a PO box in Alaska to try and get some more checks.
No, I haven't. I have not. I think 1990 was the last year I got a check from the state of Alaska. Anyway, so the I don't know. I mean, if you put this on the ballot, more people might support it. From the idea where the state could just give them money, more people might support it than you realize.
If you married it with the property tax conversation we're having right now, I think it would. You might get some heads turning around real quick. The devil's in the details, though.
Right.
I truly wonder how functional it would be. I think Senator Mathern's headspace is absolutely. I can't imagine people wouldn't agree with him that we want to know more and have maximum transparency on grants and where state dollars go. I like his bill. You had mentioned, so I want to talk about it. And if we had a little more time with him, I would have even brought up with him. You'd mentioned that basically what the transparency he's looking for, you felt was already in the Constitution.
Well, I mean, the gift clause was already in the Constitution.
That's the constitutional
right. Well,
I think he's talking about the grant process.
Right. Well, itself. What I was saying is if we added something like the gift, because I don't know how I feel about his bill. I mean, it's nice and all, but. Now, if we're already in an environment where people are struggling to pay attention and now we're going to create more reports for them to pay attention to, I don't know if that fixes the problem.
I don't know if I agree. Depending on how the report's written, you could turn it into a one-page.
I'm not against it. I mean, listen, I'm a member of the news media, so anytime there's more reports that I can go back and check on, that's a good thing. So, I mean, from that perspective, I'm just not sure it strikes at the heart of the problem. I think what you have to strike at is the Constitution says we can't do this. And we're either just violating the Constitution, which, by the way, when we're talking about the film grants, there was a $100,000 grant that just went straight out to the company that there was no grant process at all. They just cut a check to the company. How does that not violate the state constitution? So I think we need to get through that. If we're going to fund something like a film grant, or if we say, listen, we want to make dollars available for grants for a fertilizer plant, that we're not just picking a company. We don't have politicians picking a company that's going to get the money and then designing a process that is ostensibly competitive, but just filters the money straight to that company. No, that doesn't pass the smell test. I mean, so that's really what I want to see. I don't know that, more reporting stuff helps if the problem is we're doing something that's unconstitutional. And then when I said duplicative, I meant what if you put like something like the gift clause in statute in a bill? Why should you have to do that? It's already in the state constitution.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Though I think there could be something. I shouldn't belabor this point too much more, but we might not know if it is a gift or not, or what's qualifying as. Maybe we need some more scrutiny on it to make sure that that's not what's happening. But we'll see what happens with the bill. But there was a big news piece for North Dakota elected officials here this last week that we have to get into because we no longer have a presidential candidate.
Yeah, Doug Burgum ended his race. I think he was a little bitter about it. When you read the press release and he takes some shots at the RNC and stuff about clubhouse rules, let's say that. Let's
get into that for folks that didn't maybe read his email address. He dropped this last. What day was it? Friday. He dropped.
That he dropped out.
Yeah.
No, that was earlier this week.
Oh God! All right, everything's blurring together. So dropped out earlier this week.
Yeah, he dropped out. He dropped out on Monday.
Okay. Oh wow.
So yeah, and when I was talking about like he sounded kind of bitter about it. Here, let me read. This is a quote from Burgum himself that was in his press release. It said the RNC's clubhouse debate requirements are nationalizing the primary process and taking the power of democracy away from the engaged, thoughtful citizens of Iowa and New Hampshire. The RNC's mission is to win elections. It is not their mission to reduce competition and restrict fresh ideas by narrowing the field months before the Iowa caucuses or the first in the nation New Hampshire primary. These arbitrary criteria ensure advantages for candidates from major media markets on the coast versus America's heartland. None of their debate criteria relate to the qualifications related to actually doing the job of the president. This effort to nationalize the primary system is unhealthy for the future of the party, especially for a party that proclaims to value leadership from outside of Washington.
So I'm confused with this.
Okay.
If you were sticking in this long, which he did, past not qualifying for the third debate, and he already isn't qualifying for the fourth, what, to me, by the time you've spent the money you've spent and spent the time you've spent, which is, as a compliment, significant. I couldn't turn on social media without seeing a new event that Doug Burgum was doing in person in New Hampshire and Iowa. And I saw some critical social media, so it's always critical comments, but some people saying, oh, wow, you barely had anybody turn out. But it was like a smaller rural town in northern New Hampshire where he had 40, 50 people there. And I'm like, yeah, that's how you do it, one bite at a time.
Especially communities like Iowa and New Hampshire. I mean, all those little towns, they get visits from presidential candidates all the time. Like, it's not that unusual.
It'd be like taking a picture in Grafton, North Dakota, and having 30 people at the local coffee shop.
That's a pretty good turnout for Grafton.
It's like, hey, those 30 people are going to go out and tell 3 other people in Grafton that the candidate was there today. And you know what? Those are the people that decided to show up. So that was fine. To me, what I was building up to was Tim Scott dropped out. I can't remember who the other major-ish candidate was.
Mike Pence.
What?
Mike Pence.
Mike Pence. Oh, yeah, I couldn't remember his name. I couldn't remember who it was. The former vice president, also former governor, also former congressman, a clearly on paper, resume qualified individual, have both dropped out. What was it that Doug Burgum was striving for? Because every noise he made, and you don't throw your hands and give up and then keep going. Obviously, you have to sound confident on some level. But to me, if you were in it through the first week of December, why wouldn't you just wait and see what the result is in Iowa and New Hampshire and then drop? Why wouldn't you let them vote? I'm actually confused by it. Is it a consideration to run for a third term for governor?
I have a theory about that. And I don't think it's about running for governor. I think what happened is, I think Doug knew he wasn't going to get it done this cycle. And I think he has some thoughts that he might run again in 2028. And if he runs in 2028, you're running for president, you need some money people, you need some movers and shakers across the country to line up behind you. I think that a lot of those donors and movers and shakers in the Republican Party across the nation right now, they want consolidation, right? To the extent that they're not Trump, these in particular people who want someone other than Trump to be the nominee, they want consolidation on the ticket. So I think Burgum got leaned on by some of them, and he didn't want to alienate them, and so he dropped out because that's what they wanted to do. And frankly, he should have done this of his own volition a while ago, but he didn't want to damage relationships that, if he wants to run again in 2028, when he'll be in his early 70s, because he's 66 now.
Yeah.
I think he didn't want to damage his chances there, especially with some people that might be inclined to support him by the time we get to that point.
And that makes sense. I'm wondering, the timing seemed odd, but really, truly, maybe it's splitting hairs, because in my brain, if that's the case, why don't you just, when Mike Pence and Tim Scott go, why don't you say, yeah, me too. I'm in the single digits.
Because I think he had to be told. I think Doug was in it. Yeah. He had his game plan. He was following his game plan. He was going to be in it till Iowa or New Hampshire or something. And then there's a push to consolidate either behind DeSantis or Haley, depending on who you want, which, I mean, at this point, all seems futile. It seems like Trump's inevitable, but I don't know. We'll see what happens. But I mean, Doug's whining about the debate rules and everything. I still don't understand how the debate rules were all that unreasonable. I mean, in order to get on are we going to allow every crank who declares a presidential campaign up on the debate stage? We're going to have a
40-person YouTube comment section debate. They'll be even worse than the current ones.
I don't know how that serves the public. So they're winning. And I mean, for the first debate, it was like you had to have 10,000 cash. I think that was, what was the number? I don't know. You had to have some number of cash donors.
You had a donation threshold.
And you had to be over 1% in the polls.
And some polling.
And even now, what are we at? Like 5? You have to be at over 5% in the polls. I don't.
So you have to have 1/20th of market share in order to get up on stage
to get into the fourth debate. Like, he qualified for the first two, he didn't qualify for the second two, and that's because he couldn't keep pace. He couldn't keep building, and that's I think it's just voters There weren't enough Republican voters right now who wanted what Doug Burgum was offering, or wanted a campaign where he was talking about some important things. But if you're going to campaign against somebody like Donald Trump, and that's who you're campaigning against, he's the front runner, you got to talk about him. Right? So, I mean, what were you asking people to come out and support? Come out and support. I'm not going to say anything about Donald Trump. I'm just going to talk about this stuff over here. And in very anodyne, I mean, again, those are, I don't want to besmirch, because I wish Americans were more focused on the things that he wants to talk about. I wish that's what we prioritized in politics. I wish we didn't prioritize entertainment so much from our politicians, but
Are you implying that the frontrunner for the GOP nomination shouldn't have done a side tangent about Robert De Niro for 20 minutes at his last campaign speech?
You watched more of his campaign speeches than I did. I didn't even know he did that.
I'm a glutton for punishment. I'm a North Dakota Democrat. I'm a glutton for punishment.
Yeah, he must be. I don't know. I just don't see, I think Doug, and this is not me running Doug down. I think he would have made a fine president. I'm glad he ran. I think he stayed in probably a month or so too long.
I could even wrap my mind around the narrative that he is putting forward about the debate stage, about the RNC being out of touch, about this isn't what voters want. But if you are going to do that, I really wish I could have seen him say, and I believe it so much, I'm going to let the voters of Iowa and New Hampshire show you. I've been on the ground. Your fancy polls and all of your, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC hits don't matter. What matter are the people on the ground when they go to vote at the ballot box. So let's see what they say. But he didn't. He withdrew. So if you
that's what he said. I mean, that's what he was saying up until the point he withdrew. But again, I think he withdrew because the reality is, if you want to build a national campaign, there's kingmakers out there that can bring organizational support, that can bring obviously financial support. And if you want to win a national election, you need people like that. And if those people are saying, we want to consolidate around Haley or we want to consolidate around DeSantis, you don't alienate them. So I don't know that that's what happened, but that's what I think happened.
Yeah, I buy that. And I think probably a break in the dam that created the flood was probably the Coke industry's full-fledged endorsement of Nikki Haley, because what that means is billions of campaign dollars are going to be helping back her name out there, and that's going to help that consolidation as the Trump alternative. I agree with you.
Although
it's not an original opinion. I think it's too far gone. I don't
know how you peel off support from a man who he doesn't alienate. I mean, all the stuff. I mean, the convictions. I mean, not convictions. The criminal charges and everything else. I mean, if that's not enough to deter his supporters, what is? A well-articulated argument from Nikki Haley is going to do the trick? I don't know.
So he bounced. I don't think Mike Pence nor Tim Scott endorsed anyone when they dropped.
So far, Burgum hasn't either. I mean, they'll probably do that maybe later. But
I don't even think it's illegitimate to take a step back and say, hey, I was running for this nomination. Now that I'm out, it's time for vote for, Republican primary and caucus goers to decide. I don't even think that's illegitimate.
So the big speculation is, what does Doug Burgum do now? One part of that,
governor for a third term, the end.
Well, one of that is, I think that's what's going to happen. There's a lot of speculation, and there was even some, like the New York Times was reporting on rumors that Donald Trump was going to put him, court him to be in his cabinet or maybe even a running mate. Now, Burgum's on the record. Like he said on CNN, and he said to me personally, he does not want to be vice president. He does not want to be in cabinet. He also doesn't want to run for Congress. He doesn't want any of those things. He's an executive branch guy. And he doesn't want to be second fiddle. So I don't think he's going to do that. And also, like, in a normal political era, if you're someone like Doug Burgum who's thinking, okay, I've got my eyes on 2028, maybe being Secretary of Energy helps me get to 2028, maybe being vice president helps me get to 2028. The problem is you're Secretary of Energy or you're vice president in the Trump administration, which is more likely to get you indicted than it is to further your political career. So I don't know.
And you might not have a full staff. In fact, you likely won't have a full staff. One of the great unsung elements of or less talked about elements of the Trump administration was they didn't staff the government. They didn't like fully man the ship at all, like in like a really basic way. I'm not talking about growing government. I'm talking about people would leave and they just wouldn't replace them, and those jobs just wouldn't get done.
So I don't know why someone like Doug Burgum would sign up for that. So I don't think he's going to be in the cabinet. So then the question is, does he run for governor? Now, I think he probably will. If he doesn't,
I strongly agree.
I think he will. The guy's he's gonna need something to do for the next 4 years until it's time to run for president again. And I mean, listen, I think there's still probably some accomplishments that maybe he wants to finally get rid of the income tax. We can have a debate about whether or not that's a good idea, but he wants to. That's where he wants to go, and that would be kind of a landmark achievement. He got pension reform done, but that's not very sexy. That's not really the sort of thing you build a campaign around. So, I mean,
honestly, income tax is a great talking point, but for as much as the average North Dakotan feels their income tax, I don't know how much they're going to feel it. Is it a change? Yeah, it would be a change. Is it a difference in our tax structure? For sure. But how many people are like looking at tax structures? They just look at how much they pay every year.
Yeah, maybe.
And
I don't know. And yet somehow, when you look at,
you just don't pay that much into the state. You just don't.
Oh, okay. Everybody says that, but every time we reduce the income tax, it's like 125 million. What was the one they just passed? Was like over 200 some $million. Where do you think that money goes, Ben?
Straight to corporate donor. No, just kidding. It's not getting taken out of taxpayers, but it's proportion, and it's what they see other places.
Maybe.
You know how this works. You know how the campaign psychology.
But the thing is, if he wants,
he has other things to do as governor.
If he wants to use that, but if he wants to use, I got rid of income taxes in North Dakota. That's a great talking point for a national campaign in front of voters who mostly aren't North Dakotans.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For a national talking point.
So,
he had a lot of what on paper should be good national talking points about GDP growth, growing state, a lot of things in North Dakota. And I don't like it. Nobody cared. I don't like that nobody cared, but truly nobody cared.
Yeah. And that gets back to the problem is what are voters valuing right now? And it's not competent governance. Not if Donald Trump's the front runner. We're not looking for competent. We're not looking for a steady hand on the tiller, as it were.
I'll tell you what voters aren't looking for by 60%, and that's a new Fargo Dome improvement. How's that for a transition?
My Lord. The other, I did want to finish the point on this, which is that, the other thing is who would run for governor if Doug doesn't, and I don't know that if Doug decides he's a third term, then I don't think you're going to see like a big name in Republican politics challenge him. You might see like a Rick Becker, take a shot at it, and he'll, get 15, 20% like he did before.
I'd be surprised if someone who doesn't.
Sorry about that. We had a little technical difficulty there. Go ahead.
I'd be surprised if someone who would consider themselves to be an extremely conservative Republican, might label themselves as the Bastiat caucus, doesn't try to present a primary challenge to Burgum, and would probably have some narrative at a convention at least for it, which would be, hey, he served 8 years. We just got done passing a 2-term constitutional term limit. It does not apply to Doug Burgum, it's important to say, but the spirit could be a narrative for them. They could simply say he's not been a conservative enough governor. And Rick Becker played pretty decently, didn't get 50%, but got more than 40% at the convention against John Hoeven. I could see there being more holes at a state convention, not primary convention.
I think that the turnout at the next state convention for candidates is not going to be great. And that's, again, a topic for a whole other podcast, but there's not a lot of faith. I don't know that there's a lot of incentive for somebody like Doug Burgum to even bother going to the state convention. I don't think he will. If it comes to that and he's got a challenge from his right flank like Rick Becker, I think he goes straight to...
I don't know if I agree. I think he might do what John Hoeven did, go there and really put his foot down and say no, and he'll still do the primary, but that's pure speculation on my part.
Yeah, the problem is the people who hate him control most of the state legislative districts or the legislative district committees. And so, the process for getting delegates out at this point is not going to be fair. they're going to play hardball, like it or not, as
that's
much
not
as
fair. You're supposed to show up and get delegates there. That's actually how the system's supposed to work. I don't necessarily like the element, but
okay. But the thing is we have stuff happening where you can't vote in this year's convention because you didn't pay Republican Party dues last year, even though maybe you didn't live in the legislative district last year. Stuff like that's happening all over the state. There's a lot of ways where if you control the district, you could control the outcome, and they're not ashamed of using it. I was just listening to, there was a fight in Bismarck where, there's the Republican district chair is now going to challenge the sitting Republicans for the legislature. And they don't they're trying to schedule when the convention's going to be and the location, and the district chair wants the party to hold the convention in his church. And when the rest of the committee pushed back on it, he just ended the meeting. I mean, there's stuff like that that's happening. People are paying attention to it, but that process is not it's not a good one. It's not a very transparent one. It's not one people pay a lot of attention to. So I don't know.
To quote you in chat on your Friday pod, we shouldn't have this many things to talk about when we have an off year coming up in North Dakota for legislative session, and yet we have more than can be even said in an hour.
Okay, well, yeah, we got to put a pin in it there because we are coming up on an hour. So anyway, lots of that going on. If Doug Burgum doesn't run for re-election, there's going to be a lot of Republican moving parts. Kelly Armstrong, I think, would absolutely run for governor, and probably some other names as well. But we got to put a pin in it there. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.